May 1940 in northern France was a landscape of quiet unease. The early morning fog clung to the Meuse River, curling over the low hills and weaving through the scattered villages that lined its banks. Soldiers moved along the roads and paths, in muted patterns, their footsteps muffled against the damp earth. For the French defenders stationed near Sedan, life was a measured repetition of routine. Patrols were sent across bridges and roads, observation posts established on small rises, and supply lines traced carefully through fields and woods. In letters home, some soldiers described the countryside in deceptively tranquil tones: the rolling green hills, the meandering river, the smell of earth after rain. But beneath their words, there was a shared understanding that their position, though fortified, was fragile. Across the river, German forces were preparing with meticulous precision. Maps were spread across tables in command tents, units were briefed and rehearsed, and mechanized columns were quietly aligned behind wooded cover. The operation was not impulsive. It had been planned over weeks, every movement coordinated to exploit what intelligence suggested were weaknesses in the French lines. There was no fanfare, no dramatized heralding of the coming storm. The men of the Wehrmacht carried out their duties with disciplined attention, aware that the success of their mission depended on order, timing, and quiet resolve. In Sedan itself, the civilian population carried on as best they could. Farmers tended fields under the early spring sun, markets opened for brief hours, and the ordinary sounds of life, church bells, the creak of carts over cobblestones, persisted. Yet, there was a subtle tension, a sense that the world beyond the horizon was shifting in ways not entirely perceptible. Letters and reports hinted at growing concern. Rumours of German troop movements, discussions of air reconnaissance, and the occasional anxious glance at distant columns of smoke from artillery testing. For the townspeople and soldiers alike, these were not dramatic omens, but quiet signals of change, reminders that the placid mornings would not endure indefinitely. Commanders on both sides understood Sedan's significance. For the French, it represented a barrier, a natural line of defence along the Meuse that, if held, could stabilise the northern front. For the Germans, it was a point of opportunity, a gap that, if breached, could unravel the entire Allied defensive posture. Strategy was measured, not theatrical. French officers walked along the defensive lines, inspecting bunkers and machine gun emplacements, marking positions for reinforcements that were already thinly stretched. The soldiers manning these positions, many conscripted from regions far from northern France, experienced a mix of duty, uncertainty, and quiet anticipation. Their letters often reflected these complex emotions, describing the camaraderie of shared watch duties alongside the awareness of isolation and vulnerability. Even the weather played its role in shaping the rhythm of the days. Rain often fell, in gentle intervals, soaking uniforms and softening the riverbanks, while patches of sun occasionally pierced the cloud cover, illuminating the stone facades of Sedan with fleeting warmth. These natural elements were not incidental. They influenced troop movements, reconnaissance patrols, and the positioning of artillery. Soldiers became attuned to the subtleties of wind, fog, and light, understanding that minor changes could carry significant consequences. In these moments, the human and the natural environment were interwoven, each shaping the other in ways that felt inevitable, not contrived. The early hours were dominated by routine inspections, signalling, and quiet observation. French artillery units tested their range, sending shells over familiar fields, each strike measured and deliberate. Soldiers in forward positions noted the patterns of German reconnaissance planes overhead, recording their paths and potential targets. Small incidents, a misfired gun, a supply wagon stuck in mud, a patrol delayed by the river crossing, were noted in logs with understated concern. These were the small human rhythms that, in retrospect, mapped the delicate balance of preparation and vulnerability. Meanwhile, the German forces continued their methodical positioning. Armoured units were concealed in woods and behind ridges. Infantry columns moved along minor roads, and engineers prepared bridges and fords for crossing. Each action was designed to avoid detection and maintain momentum for the operation planned to begin within days. The soldiers followed orders with quiet attention, aware that the success of the operation depended less on individual heroism and more on disciplined adherence to plan. Letters and diaries from German soldiers of the period often reflect this focus. There was anticipation, but it was grounded in procedure, not spectacle. As the days progressed, minor interactions revealed the psychological strain quietly accumulating on both sides. French officers discussed contingencies in hushed tones, aware of the limitations of their lines. Soldiers spoke to one another in moments of respite, voices low, recounting small personal anecdotes or the news from home. On the German side, engineers and infantrymen shared small jokes to alleviate monotony, maintaining morale through routine and familiarity. This quiet human element, mundane, understated, yet profoundly revealing, was a constant undercurrent, shaping perceptions of what was coming without introducing artificial drama. The subtle hook emerges here, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the slow, almost imperceptible convergence of preparation, observation, and human expectation. Across the river, both sides were performing their routines, measuring the land, calculating ranges, and noting vulnerabilities. Soldiers carried out their duties, unaware of the full scale of what was about to unfold, yet moving within a framework that made the coming events inevitable. Every patrol, every letter, every observation contributed to a chain of circumstances that would soon transform the tranquil hills and riverside towns into a theatre of movement and consequence. By the end of this chapter, the viewer understands Sedan as both place and pivot point. A town of ordinary people and ordinary soldiers, situated within a landscape of calculated military intentions. The calm is deliberate, not naive. It is the quiet before the inevitable motion, setting the emotional and historical stage for the breach of defences that will follow. The audience senses the tension without being forced into spectacle, appreciating the weight of human lives, the precision of strategy, and the small, almost invisible signs that herald change. In this way, Sedan in May 1940 is revealed not as an abstract battlefield, but as a human environment shaped by geography, preparation, and awareness. The foggy mornings, the cautious patrols, the quiet letters, all contribute to a sense of inevitability, making the events to come comprehensible, even if not yet fully revealed. The stage is set, the actors in place, and the subtle currents of history begin to flow. The morning of May 12, 1940, arrived with the same subdued quiet that had marked the previous days. Along the Meuse River, the French defences stood as if waiting, unaware that the landscape itself was about to shift beneath them. On the German side, the Wehrmacht moved with disciplined precision. Troop formations navigated narrow forest paths, armoured vehicles rumbled quietly over dirt roads, and engineers adjusted pontoon bridges and prepared for the river crossing with the meticulous care of a man assembling a machine, each part reliant on the other. There was no rush, only the measured tempo of strategy translated into action, an orchestration of thousands of men and machines. For the French defenders, Sedan represented a fragile but vital barrier. Artillery units were positioned on the high ground, infantry dug into foxholes, and observation posts scanned the opposite bank. Letters from soldiers hint at a mixture of confidence and quiet unease. Some wrote of the familiarity of their positions, the security of trenches and bunkers, and the camaraderie of shared duty. Others noted the subtle signals of change, unusual movements of enemy scouts, distant sounds of engines that seemed out of place, and the growing weight of anticipation. These were not dramatic premonitions, but observations rooted in lived experience. The small details that, when considered together, hinted at the scale of the challenge they faced. Across the river, the German advance unfolded with meticulous planning. Artillery units were deployed first, their positions calculated to suppress the French defences without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Shells fell at regular intervals on the high ground, each impact measured and precise. Infantry units followed, moving through woods and fields to avoid detection, while engineers prepared crossing points at selected fords and bridges. Each movement was carefully coordinated to maintain the rhythm of the operation. There was no spectacle, no unnecessary haste. Only the quiet execution of strategy, where timing and accuracy mattered more than daring displays of courage. The human dimension of the crossing was as intricate as the military maneuvers. German soldiers carried out their tasks under the same foggy sky, feeling the weight of responsibility and the unspoken understanding that any error could disrupt the entire operation. Letters written after the fact reveal their awareness of the stakes, tempered by the discipline instilled through months of preparation. They moved with an almost imperceptible tension, attentive to orders, to terrain, and to one another, creating a sense of unity and inevitability. On the French side, the first signs of the German crossing were subtle. Artillery observers noted the movement of shadows through the early morning mist, the glint of metal reflecting sunlight on the river. Patrols reported small incursions. Scouts detected unusual activity along the banks, and officers issued incremental adjustments to defensive positions. Yet, the responses were measured, constrained by available manpower, and hampered by communication. Delays. The French forces were stretched, relying on prior assumptions about the enemy's approach, and these small misalignments began to compound into larger vulnerabilities. As the first German units moved onto pontoon bridges, the river itself became a theatre of quiet but consequential action. Soldiers balanced across floating planks, vehicles inched carefully onto makeshift crossings, and engineers supported the structures with calm vigilance. Each crossing point was the product of careful calculation, the labour of preparation, and the anticipation of resistance. Observers on the French side registered these movements, but there was no immediate sense of panic, only cautious monitoring, as if the unfolding operation had the potential for success or failure depending on minor adjustments that were still within human control. The riverbank was not merely a geographic barrier, it was a stage for the interplay between human ingenuity and environmental factors. Rain had softened the soil, making the placement of artillery and vehicles more precarious. The fog both concealed and revealed, shifting with the wind, creating moments of surprise and moments of clarity. Soldiers on both sides became attuned to these subtleties, understanding that the environment was a participant in the unfolding events, influencing movement, timing, and perception. In this way, the crossing of the Meuse was not only a military operation, but a complex interaction between men, machines, and landscape. Communication, or its absence, emerged as a critical factor. French officers attempted to coordinate units scattered along the high ground, issuing orders through runners, telephones, and radios that were sometimes unreliable. Reports of the crossing were delayed or misinterpreted, creating small gaps in understanding that would have larger consequences in the hours to come. German commanders, by contrast, relied on pre-established plans and signals, ensuring that their advance remained coherent even as units moved through challenging terrain. The contrast was subtle yet consequential, demonstrating how organization and foresight could shape the outcome before the first major confrontation had fully developed. Amid the movement, individual experiences illustrate the human reality behind the strategic narrative. A French artilleryman watched the distant bridges, noting each shadow and sound, feeling the weight of responsibility and uncertainty. A German engineer balanced across a pontoon, aware that the stability of the crossing depended on every careful step. Infantrymen on both sides wrote later about the strange combination of routine and heightened awareness, The ordinariness of preparing for action, coupled with the recognition that these were moments where lives and outcomes hinged on small, precise actions. By midday, German units had established small footholds on the far bank. Infantry advanced methodically behind the cover of artillery fire. Engineers secured bridges, and the momentum of the operation began to shift the balance. The French defenders, despite their efforts, faced mounting pressure. Small gaps in observation and communication, minor delays in reinforcement, and the cumulative effect of continuous artillery fire created conditions that would soon allow a larger breach. The narrative here is not one of heroism or sudden catastrophe, but of quiet inevitability, the slow accumulation of small, human-scaled factors that would shape the battle. Through this measured lens, the crossing of the Meuse emerges as both a technical achievement and a deeply human experience. The precision of planning, the discipline of execution, and the subtle interplay of environmental and organizational factors illustrate why the operation succeeded at this stage. The chapter leaves the audience with a clear sense of progression. The stage has shifted from preparation to action, the river has been crossed, and the human and strategic currents are converging toward the collapse of the French defensive line that will follow in the next chapter. By the afternoon of May 13th, 1940, the French defensive line along the Meuse had begun to show the strain of sustained pressure. What had been carefully prepared positions, intended to hold back an enemy advance, were now being tested in ways that revealed both structural and human vulnerabilities. Soldiers manning the forward positions felt the gradual shift, the subtle erosion of security that comes not from a single dramatic blow, but from the accumulation of small, relentless pressures. The artillery fire, precise and continuous, was eroding morale and physical readiness in equal measure. Trenches became muddy quagmires. Communications faltered as wires snapped under bombardment. Men moved cautiously, aware that their actions were constrained by circumstance as much as by orders from above. French officers struggled to maintain a coherent response. Units were dispersed along the high ground, attempting to cover multiple crossing points, yet the chain of command was under increasing strain. Runners carrying messages were slowed by shell fire. Lines of communication were interrupted, and the attempts to coordinate reinforcements became increasingly fragmented. Letters later found in barracks reflected a combination of frustration and quiet resignation. The soldiers understood their duties, but they were constrained by the limitations of manpower, equipment, and terrain. Each decision, each adjustment, felt provisional, a temporary patch on a structure already beginning to give way. On the German side, the advance continued with disciplined consistency. Infantry moved behind the cover of artillery, tanks maneuvered along forested tracks to provide support, and engineers worked swiftly to maintain and expand crossing points. The human experience here was one of meticulous focus. Soldiers described the rhythm of movement, the careful attention to signals and orders, and the collective awareness that their progress depended on small, precise actions executed in coordination with hundreds of others. The collapse of the French defences was not sudden, but rather an inevitable consequence of planning, preparation, and the relentless application of pressure. Small incidents highlighted the fragility of the French positions. A machine gun crew, ordered to hold a forward post, found itself cut off as surrounding units retreated under fire. Communication delays prevented timely reinforcement. Artillery observers reported that enemy units had crossed undetected in certain sectors, exploiting natural cover and gaps in patrol patterns. Each of these instances, while minor in isolation, combined to create a cascading effect. Soldiers on the line began to sense that their positions were becoming increasingly untenable, and with that recognition came a quiet, pervasive tension. The psychological dimension was as crucial as the physical. Men on both sides experienced fatigue, stress, and heightened awareness, yet responded differently. French soldiers felt the pressure of expectation and the weight of uncertainty. aware that their defensive positions might soon fail. Some wrote of the fear of letting comrades down, of the shame of retreating under circumstances beyond their control. German soldiers, while executing a successful operation, faced the strain of maintaining discipline amidst the chaos of combat and the anticipation of resistance. In both cases, the human element shaped outcomes, not through dramatic gestures, but through accumulated small decisions, adjustments, and reactions. As evening approached, the Meuse crossings became fully operational. German infantry and armoured units moved inland, encountering sporadic resistance, but steadily advancing. The French artillery, though active and persistent, was increasingly constrained by disrupted supply lines, damaged observation posts, and the exhaustion of personnel. Officers attempted to plug gaps, but the scale of the challenge exceeded the resources at their disposal. In diary entries recovered after the war, several French soldiers reflected on the surreal quality of the day, the sense that the battlefield itself was slipping away from them, that positions once secure were now vulnerable to forces they could not fully observe or influence. By nightfall, the collapse was perceptible along multiple sectors. Defensive lines had thinned, positions were abandoned in some areas, and small units were isolated from their main forces. The human experience of these moments was not one of panic, but of quiet endurance. Soldiers navigated under darkness, maintaining vigilance despite fatigue, confusion, and the increasing difficulty of coordinating with distant comrades. The narrative here emphasizes inevitability. The combination of structural weaknesses, communication failures, and persistent enemy pressure made the collapse not a matter of chance, but a foreseeable outcome of accumulated conditions. The French command attempted to adjust, issuing orders to regroup, counterattack, and stabilize the line. Yet these efforts were piecemeal and constrained. Reinforcements arrived sporadically, often delayed or misdirected. Field reports sometimes contradicted one another, creating uncertainty about the precise disposition of units. In this environment, even small errors had outsized consequences. Each adjustment, though well-intentioned, was limited by the operational reality on the ground. The audience begins to understand that military failure is rarely instantaneous. It is the cumulative effect of decisions, delays, and human limitations intersecting with environmental and logistical realities. The German advance, in contrast, exemplified the disciplined execution of pre-planned strategy. Engineers ensured the integrity of crossing points. Infantry pressed forward with methodical determination. Tanks provided cover and suppressed counterattacks. Reports and later memoirs describe the quiet, persistent coordination that allowed units to exploit vulnerabilities as they emerged. The collapse of French defences was therefore not sudden or theatrical, but the product of a systematic operation, meeting unprepared and stretched defensive positions. Each German action built upon previous gains, creating a sense of forward momentum that contrasted with the French struggle to hold the line. Through the night, the narrative continues to unfold, along multiple levels: structural, operational, and human. Soldiers, officers, and civilians alike experience the slow unraveling of defensive arrangements, the tension of anticipation, and the burden of responsibility. By focusing on the cumulative pressures rather than isolated acts of heroism or failure, the story conveys the inevitability of Sedan's fall without relying on dramatization. It allows the audience to see both sides, to understand the human experiences, and to appreciate the factors: preparation, communication, fatigue, and environmental constraints that determined the outcome. By the close of this chapter, Sedan's defences had been compromised in key sectors. The French army's ability to mount a coherent response was severely diminished, while German forces were poised to advance further inland. The collapse was neither complete nor instantaneous, but it had begun in a manner that was both understandable and unavoidable. The audience is left with a sense of historical inevitability, the quiet accumulation of pressures, and the human experiences that accompany operational failure. The stage is now set for the next chapter, where the German advance moves beyond the river and into the heart of the region, carrying consequences for soldiers and civilians alike. The morning after Sedan fell, the landscape of northern France began to change in ways that were both subtle and profound. Fields that had been dotted with soldiers and artillery now bore the traces of movement. Tracks of armoured vehicles, flattened grass along patrol paths, and the faint impressions of infantry crossing the terrain. For the German forces, the breach at Sedan represented a point of opportunity, a pivot that allowed momentum to carry them into the heartland. Orders were precise but not rushed. The advance was methodical, measured, and sustained. Each unit knew its role, and each action was part of a larger orchestration, moving with quiet inevitability toward a strategic objective that had been long planned. For the French army, the retreat from Sedan was a moment of stark reality. Units that had remained cohesive found themselves reconfiguring on the fly, filling gaps left by those forced to withdraw. Officers attempted to maintain a coherent defensive line, but communication remained disrupted and resources were limited. Soldiers on the front described the strain of constant movement under pressure, the difficulty of maintaining cohesion, and the psychological weight of retreat. There was no dramatic panic, only the persistent human struggle to navigate uncertainty and fulfill duty under conditions increasingly beyond control. The civilian population now became an unavoidable part of the narrative. Towns along the route of the German advance saw early arrivals of mechanized columns, often moving faster than local authorities could react. Families gathered what belongings they could. Roads became congested with carts and vehicles, and fear, quiet, pervasive, and deliberate, settled into the streets. Observers later recalled the surreal juxtaposition. The ordinary rhythms of life disrupted not by spectacle, but by the steady movement of soldiers, the hum of engines, and the distant reports of artillery. Each step of the advance had human consequences, touching the lives of civilians who were unprepared yet compelled to adapt. The German army, advancing from Sedan, maintained cohesion through careful planning. Infantry and armour moved in coordinated formations, supported by engineers who repaired roads, maintained bridges, and ensured supply lines kept pace. Artillery units provided covering fire in a measured, continuous rhythm that allowed infantry to move forward without pause. Soldiers were aware of their role within the larger operation, and the quiet discipline required for the advance emphasized collective responsibility over individual action. Personal diaries from this period reflect a mixture of anticipation, fatigue, and professional focus. Emotions grounded in the reality of long marches, the monotony of repeated movements, and the weight of historical significance. French forces, now repositioning deeper into central France, faced not only the physical consequences of the breach, but also the strategic dislocation that it created. Commands attempted to form new defensive lines, but gaps persisted and units were often isolated from one another. Communication was intermittent, and the flow of information was slowed by the distance and the chaos of movement. Soldiers and officers alike felt the compounding pressure of these conditions, understanding that each decision, each misstep, contributed incrementally to the erosion of defensive coherence. In this context, the advance was not merely a movement of troops, it was a process that unfolded through countless small actions, each with consequences that multiplied as the hours passed. The landscape itself played a subtle but influential role. Roads, bridges, and rivers shaped the pace and direction of movement. Woods and fields offered cover, while open plains exposed units to observation and fire. Weather continued to assert its influence. Intermittent rain softened the terrain, while fog occasionally obscured positions, delaying both movement and reconnaissance. Soldiers became attuned to these variables, learning to navigate not only the enemy but also the environment itself. In these interactions, the human and geographic elements were inseparable. creating a narrative of advance that was as much about adaptation and observation as it was about combat. As the day progressed, isolated engagements occurred, skirmishes with French rearguards, artillery exchanges, and the occasional defensive stand. These were not decisive battles in themselves, but they punctuated the advance with moments of resistance that revealed the human dimension of the operation. Soldiers on both sides acted within the constraints imposed by circumstance. French troops attempted to delay the enemy. German units moved to secure positions while maintaining forward momentum. Each encounter was a small thread in the larger tapestry of movement, demonstrating that operational success depends not on individual heroics, but on the cumulative effects of coordination, adaptation, and endurance. The civilian experience of the advance became increasingly pronounced. Villages saw the arrival of German units before defensive lines were fully established, leaving local populations caught between fleeing soldiers and advancing columns. Families left homes with only essential belongings, towns emptied, and roads became congested with refugees seeking safety. Observers later recorded the quiet terror, the exhaustion of constant movement, and the disorientation caused by seeing the familiar landscape transformed almost overnight into a theatre of military logistics. These human experiences were central to the narrative. The advance was not an abstract maneuver, but a lived reality for thousands of soldiers and civilians alike. By evening, the German momentum had carried units beyond the initial line of Sedan, stretching into central sectors and forcing the French army to react under constrained conditions. Rearguard actions slowed but did not halt progress. Officers documented the difficulty of reorganizing depleted units, maintaining communications, and providing support to soldiers fatigued by days of continuous action. Diaries from both French and German soldiers reflect an understated theme. Success and failure are often the product of cumulative, measured efforts rather than sudden, dramatic gestures. The chapter closes with the advance firmly underway, the operational gains from Sedan now radiating outward across the northern French heartland. The narrative emphasizes inevitability over spectacle. Each movement, each adjustment, each human decision contributes to the unfolding consequences. Civilians and soldiers alike experience the gradual reshaping of their environment, the continuous pressure of strategy meeting human endurance, and the reality of lives intersecting with historical events that, once begun, could not be reversed. The audience is left with a measured understanding of the scale, precision, and human dimension of the German advance, setting the stage for the next chapter, where the long-term consequences of the breakthrough will become clearer and the human toll more evident. The days following the fall of Sedan were marked by a quiet reckoning. For the French army, the breach represented not only a loss of territory, but the unraveling of plans, expectations, and confidence. Commanders attempted to reorganize units, establish new defensive positions, and coordinate with distant allies. But the chain of events set in motion at Sedan had created conditions that were difficult to reverse. Orders were issued with urgency, but the physical and psychological pressures on the troops constrained the effectiveness of these efforts. Soldiers moved with a mixture of resolve and weariness, aware that their positions were now reactive rather than proactive. Civilians, too, felt the immediate consequences. Families who had fled towns near the Meuse returned cautiously, finding homes abandoned or damaged, fields trampled by armoured columns, and infrastructure strained under the movement of armies. Refugee streams continued towards central France, creating tension, confusion, and fatigue. Yet, amid these challenges, there was resilience. Letters and memoirs describe acts of quiet endurance, neighbours helping one another, small communities, organising food and shelter, and individuals maintaining routines even as the world around them shifted. The human response to displacement, though understated, reveals the enduring capacity for adaptation amidst upheaval. On the German side, The operation's success reinforced the discipline and precision that had guided the advance. Soldiers and officers alike noted the efficiency of their progress, the coordination of units, and the relative predictability of outcomes when planning and execution aligned. Yet these reflections were tempered by the awareness of human cost, the exhaustion of men, the strain of continuous movement, and the responsibilities inherent in occupying new territory. Even victorious units carried with them an understanding that success in war is inseparable from the effort, endurance, and vigilance required to maintain it. The French army, in its retreat, faced the dual challenges of regrouping and preserving morale. Rearguard actions, attempts at counterattacks, and efforts to fortify secondary positions were all undertaken with a recognition of the limitations imposed by terrain, manpower, and disrupted communication. Soldiers described a mix of frustration, acceptance, and determination. They understood that the fall of Sedan was not simply a result of enemy strength, but also a consequence of structural weaknesses, logistical constraints, and the unpredictable realities of combat. These reflections allow the audience to perceive failure not as an abstract event, but as the intersection of human effort, circumstance, and history. The broader historical implications were immediately apparent. The fall of Sedan opened pathways for further advances into northern France, reshaping strategic calculations for both sides. Political leaders and military planners analyzed the event, seeking to understand how defensive failures had occurred and what lessons could be drawn. Historians would later highlight the cumulative effects: miscommunication, dispersed units, delayed reinforcements, and the disciplined application of enemy strategy. From this perspective, Sedan was not merely a battle, but a case study in how operational planning, human decision-making, and environmental factors converged to produce outcomes with far-reaching consequences. The psychological impact on soldiers was profound. Letters, diaries, and personal accounts reveal the mix of emotions that accompanied both retreat and advance. Fear, fatigue, and uncertainty were balanced by duty, camaraderie, and the recognition of one's role within larger operations. Soldiers reflected on the ordinariness of their experiences, the careful observation, the waiting, the repeated actions that cumulatively determined outcomes. These human elements offer insight into the lived reality of warfare, that events of immense historical significance unfold through the aggregation of countless small, deliberate actions, rather than through isolated, dramatic gestures. Civilians, too, internalized these events in quiet ways. Communities adapted to new realities, rebuilt routines, and sought stability amidst dislocation. Observers noted the subtle interplay between fear and resilience, despair and adaptation, as ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary circumstances. Roads once traveled for commerce became arteries of movement and survival. Homes became temporary shelters or command posts. The landscape itself, scarred by conflict yet enduring, bore witness to the interaction between human decisions and historical forces. Strategically, Sedan's fall influenced the trajectory of the early stages of the Second World War. Commanders and historians later analyzed how the breach at Sedan enabled German forces to penetrate deeper into France, undermine defensive cohesion, and create conditions that led to broader operational successes. The consequences were not immediate in every sector, but the ripple effects shaped campaigns, morale, and strategic decision-making. Through careful reflection, the audience comes to understand the event's significance as both a moment of tactical achievement and a catalyst for larger historical developments. Reflection on the human dimension remains central. Soldiers on both sides, civilians and commanders, all navigated the unfolding reality with attention, endurance, and adaptation. Memoirs and letters convey the understated courage required to maintain composure, make decisions, and continue acting within constrained circumstances. The narrative emphasizes the inevitability of the sequence of events, showing that human experience in war is often a product of accumulated conditions, relationships, and decisions rather than sudden, isolated actions. By the close of this chapter, Sedan stands as a point of convergence of strategy, geography, human action, and consequence. The breach's immediate tactical effects are clear, the human cost evident, and the historical ramifications unmistakable. Yet the story is not one of spectacle, but of cumulative understanding. The quiet pressures, the measured decisions, the endurance of individuals, and the interplay of circumstance and planning. The audience is left with a sense of completion, not in dramatic flourish, but in reflective comprehension of why the failure occurred, what it meant for those who lived it, and how it shaped the broader course of the conflict. In conclusion, the aftermath of Sedan demonstrates that history unfolds through the interplay of preparation, human action, and environmental reality. Soldiers and civilians navigated the consequences with endurance, resourcefulness, and adaptation. Commanders assessed outcomes, adjusted strategies, and sought to understand failures without dramatizing them. The audience is encouraged to see the battle as both a tactical event and a human experience, where the fall of a defensive line reverberates through lives, landscapes, and the trajectory of war itself. It is a reflection on the inevitability of events shaped by human choices, circumstance, and circumstance's interaction with deliberate action. Sedan, in retrospect, becomes a lens through which the complexity of warfare, the weight of human responsibility, and the subtle forces shaping history are revealed with clarity and gravity.